just start by giving you a little bit of an overview of the context that we're working with in Edmonton. And then we'll talk a little bit around Edmonton's history and experience with initiatives related to policies that support inclusive communities, and a little bit about what we learned and the next sort of a new approach and next steps. So Edmonton is Canada's 5th largest municipality. Our census metropolitan area has 1.3 million people living in it. Approximately just under 1 million of them live within the city of Edmonton proper. We are a young city, younger than average, about 5.5 years. And we also have a very large or significant urban Indigenous population of close to 76, or just over 76,000 people, which makes it the 2nd largest urban Indigenous population in Canada, only after Winnipeg. We also have quite a diverse city and have approximately 40% of Edmontonians identifying as a visible minority, and this has grown from 30% in just a decade. So we have seen a lot of increased immigration and newcomers to Canada who often land in other cities but find their way to Edmonton. Edmonton's economy is heavily driven by petrochemical industries, much like the city of Calgary, and so that's had some interesting policy implications for us and the boom-bust economic cycle, as we'll see later. But we also have a significant public sector employment, so health, post-secondary education, and government. Edmonton's the capital of Alberta, and so a lot of government is located there. In terms of housing need, in 2016, approximately 48,550 renter households were overspending on their rent, spending more than 30%. And of those, 22,350 were spending more than 50% of their gross income on shelter costs. What that translates to is approximately 60% of renters in Edmonton are in core housing need. The average market rent in Edmonton, just to give you a bit of context, is just over $1,000 a month for a 1-bedroom and $1,246 for a 2-bedroom. And there are about 6,000 people, I believe, on Capital Region Housing's waiting list, which is our social rent geared to income social housing, and that's compared to a total number of units around 4,500. With respect to homelessness, on Edmonton's by names list as of September 2019 had 1,634 Edmontonians experiencing chronic homelessness. And we have significant issues in our city with encampments. You can see that map on the left there. Although homelessness is often regarded as an inner city issue, in Edmonton, we find encampments all over the city. And so you can see that by the map there. I guess the other thing I'll note, and I could touch on it later, but what's unique about our encampment problem is that we have these issues in spite of excess available shelter capacity. So we have about 90% of our shelter capacity is in one organization, and they operate at about a 70% capacity over the course of a year. So obviously there's some issues around low barrier shelters and other barriers that are preventing people from wanting to stay in shelter. With respect to the City of Edmonton's role in affordable housing, it's over time, the emphasis has changed, but it's often consisted of the same basic roles. So that's policy and regulation through our role as the municipality and land use planning. It also includes grant funding, land provision, advocacy, and then also just convening, I guess, generally. So the way that this has kind of taken shape is in the 60s and from the 60s to 80s, like many municipalities across Canada, we were partnering with the federal government and the provincial government to build social housing. In 1977, we created our own wholly owned nonprofit, HomeEd, when policy shifted more towards nonprofit development. In the 90s, when the federal government pulled out and the province of Alberta also pulled out of investment in affordable housing, we focused more on ensuring minimum standards for market housing, so things like SROs and substandard housing. And then in the 2000s, when we started booming again and our rents started rising, we started experiencing growing homelessness, and that led to a whole flurry of activities supported by the province, including us becoming for the first time a grant funder for nonprofits. And then there's a few other pieces there that I'll get into later. I just put this in here for my municipality colleagues, because I'm always interested in how you guys structure your work. So at the city, I oversee a section of about 30 people, and the functions that we do are included here. So it includes a dedicated communications person, a dedicated public engagement person in our external relations area, as well as staff that support our efforts to advocate to the province and the federal government, which is a lot of our time. We also have a policy planning and research arm, a group that oversees project development, including reviewing proposals and supporting them through the planning process. We have a funding and asset management group that focuses on grant provision or grant agreements and land leases, sales agreements, and then the compliance pieces associated with that. And then lastly, we have a group that focuses on sort of frontline homelessness issues. So even though we have a CBO in Edmonton that's awesome, Homeward Trust that's done a lot around homelessness, the city still has a lot of touch points into that, and more that's becoming work for our section. So one place where I think I'll diverge a little bit from some of the other presentations is because the City of Edmonton is not, at least not presently, we don't directly develop affordable housing ourselves. So when we think about inclusive housing, and actually this has been a theme throughout our history, we think of it more from the perspective of not just inclusive developments or one development or one neighborhood. We think about it as how do we ensure that there's access to affordable housing across the entire city. And so that means we've had policies that have consistently encouraged a range of housing types and price points that are generally available all over. And over time, we've used a range of policy tools and other instruments to achieve these goals. So my presentation is going to focus mostly on what that's looked like. And so to demonstrate this, I'll just touch on a bit of history and the boom-bust nature. So the way it's been in Edmonton is, generally speaking, emphasis on affordable housing by council has aligned with a severely constrained private sector market driven by oil boom, basically. So the first one that we had was in 1967, which ignited a strong period of growth through the 70s, and that led to a ton of concern for affordable housing. Our 1971 general plan specifically acknowledged the role of the city in ensuring affordable housing and said, a primary goal of our government is the responsibility of ensuring every citizen is afforded the opportunity to have a decent place in which to live. Public housing is necessary to provide safe, decent accommodation at reasonable rent levels. So during that time, we partnered or created the Edmonton Community Housing Organization, which ultimately morphed into Capital Region Housing, which oversaw the construction of close to just under 3,000 units by the 1980s. We also tried some other interesting experiments, including in 1972, we had a land dedication policy that was really like an early form of inclusionary housing that required developers to provide land for medium density social housing to accommodate 5% of the projected population of every neighborhood at no cost to the city. As you can imagine, that policy did not last long. In 1979, it was struck down by the courts as an overstep of municipal jurisdiction, but we did try, and we did get some land out of it. We also led a city-led development called Millwoods, which was just under 5,000 acres of a planned community starting in the 1970s, where the city had undertaken proactive land banking and bought some land from the province. And in that plan, in that development, we committed to providing a wide range of housing types and social housing for a minimum of 5% of the community's population, equally distributed throughout the whole development or the community. So in practicality, what that looked like is we partnered with the province and the Alberta Social Housing Corporation, or through the Alberta Social Housing Corporation and CMHC, to provide subsidized interest rates for low-income home buyers. And we also provided a lot of land for co-op housing to be developed throughout the development. The city's role at that time was still more of a limited funding partner, but we were heavily focused on providing land, and that's how we mostly achieved our goals. More recently, in the early 80s, global oil prices took a huge decline, and the federal government brought in the National Energy Program, and that combined with provincial policies of austerity meant that we didn't really recover, our economy didn't really recover again until the 1990s, the late 1990s. So in the late 1990s, we had another boom, and so throughout the 80s, we weren't as active on affordable housing. and early 90s. It wasn't, like I said, until the late 1990s we got more back into it. And the reason we did is because we started to observe increasing homelessness in Edmonton. As Edmonton's interesting because, and Calgary's I'm probably the same too, we have more homeless when it's booming and more homelessness when it's not booming. So like, yeah, because when it's booming, we get a lot of homelessness, even though the economy is doing really well, because people move here and they can't afford rental. And then when the economy is not doing so well, we also are a catchment for a lot of northern Alberta and the oil and gas sector up there, where people will come into Edmonton because they lose their jobs and have no other place to go. So we also, it's kind of like peak to peak, sort of in terms of economics. So it's only when our economy is kind of stable that we start to make some progress, I think, on homelessness. Anyways, this period reinvigorated a period of affordable housing activity, and there was really a flurry of activity in the early 2000s across Alberta, and a lot of that was backed by the government of Alberta returning to affordable housing in a big way and spending $1 billion over 3 years. So of that $1 billion that they had for affordable housing strategy, they gave $125 million directly to the city of Edmonton, and the city of Edmonton matched that with $25 million of our own funds and administered on their behalf a grant program, which ultimately constructed 3,300 units of affordable rental. We also had, at the time, a new city plan that came into effect called The Way We Grow, which, and I'm not a planner, so I don't want to get this wrong. Shout out to Michaela in the back who helped me with this. We made some progress by requiring increased minimum densities and a mix of unit types in all of our new neighborhood area structure plans. So what that means is, Sarah referred to earlier as Calgary in the boom times, suburbanized and McMansionized, I guess is the way to say it. But maybe one area where Edmonton slightly diverged is during the boom times, we forced, in the context of people not being able to afford homes and high rents, we forced new neighborhoods to adopt aggressive density targets, which means that basically every new neighborhood that was approved in Edmonton had mixed forms, so multifamily, single family, that sort of thing, which isn't directly tied to affordability, but obviously has impacts. We also launched a program called the Secondary Suite Grant Program. And so what that was is we do a matching grant with homeowners to try and, part of it was to try and bring illegal suites into compliance, and part of it was to try and spur more purpose-built rental through secondary suites. And so we launched this program. So you can see on the map that's been helpful from an inclusive community perspective, because those units have been spurred all over the city. So this shows all the legal suites in Edmonton. Only about a third of these would have been funded under the program, but they're still, you can see they're in all parts of the city, in new neighborhoods, old neighborhoods, that sort of thing. We also, in the early 2000s, took a stab at our own voluntary developer-sponsored affordable housing program. And so when I say voluntary, it's because we negotiated it in the absence of any formal powers to have inclusionary housing. So it was basically, we call it the 585 program. Basically what we did is, in zones where they were negotiated zones, in Edmonton that's called direct control zones, we always requested an option to buy 5% of units at 85% of market value. And so through that, so it's not the most cost-effective program, as you can imagine. And through that program, we yielded about 35 units or so, because what we found is, and we just completed an evaluation of the program, and basically found that there was a lot of challenges, unsurprisingly, because we didn't have any legal authority and it was voluntary. But we basically created about 30 units in new buildings that were now owned by the city. They could only be in condominiumized buildings because we had no legal instrument for ensuring that they'd be rented at the rate that we wanted them at without owning them, at least under our lawyer's interpretation of our authority under the MGA. And so obviously there's huge operational challenges with managing a few units in a number of buildings spread all over, and it's also quite cost prohibitive. And when you look at the condo fees associated with them, we're also often bumping up on over-subsidizing them to achieve below market rents. So it was a noble attempt to try and bring industry into the conversation and have them contribute in a time when the market was constrained, but ultimately our lack of legal authority really impacted those program performances. One more successful initiative, though, is our Serpas school site initiative, which we started during the same time period. And basically, at that time, council made 40 vacant school sites that had been planned into neighborhoods all around Edmonton, and made those available for first-time homebuyer programs and affordable rent and mixed-income affordable housing. So we have 40 sites that are basically in large fields that were parcels that were designed to have schools and parks. And then when the neighborhood population didn't reach the density to support the school boards declared those sites vacant. And so we turned those into housing sites. So you can imagine that was pretty controversial, but because of the political will around affordable housing at the time, like vacancy rates were, less than 1%, and the price of new homes were going through the roof, council was able to get the province to bypass the regulatory requirements to do any public engagement on the rezoning of the parkland that we turned into housing sites. So we continue to develop those sites today. They're super controversial. We have one going to public hearing in December that already has had 300 people showing up at a protest against it. But nonetheless, it has helped ensure that there's opportunities for affordable housing in a lot of neighborhoods where there's otherwise would be no opportunity, because it's all either larger single-family homes or very limited in terms of redevelopment potential. And then lastly, I'll just say we also launched the 10-year Plan to End Homelessness around this time in 2009, at the end of it. And that was really involved obviously a housing first approach. It was funded by the province. And in the early days, we've been much more successful now, but in the early days, I think it involved a lot of experimentation in partnerships with private landlords. And we learned a lot of lessons around, how many housing first people could be in a building and maintain balance or buy-in from the neighbors and that sort of thing. And so there was a perception at the time that a lot of that effort was going into inner city buildings where the rents were more affordable, and that created something which then preoccupied us later called the pause. So it was a bit of a backlash. So all this affordable housing activity was perceived to be dominant, although that wasn't actually the case. There was concern in 5 inner city neighborhoods that they were getting a disproportionate share of affordable housing. So there was a lot of activity, buildings being funded, new permits being applied for, and these 5 inner city communities spent a lot of time at the subdivision appeal board fighting these housing proposals. And so what that led to was something that, like a big backlash, where the neighborhoods there raised concerns around a concentration of poverty, and felt that affordable housing needed to be distributed to other parts of the city as well, so that there would be more room for private market development in the inner city. And so in 2012, our city council actually approved what would be like the opposite of an inclusive community policy, called the non-market housing investment pause, or moratorium. That's my opinion. In those 5 inner cities. So it was meant as a 3-year cooling off period, which basically it said, if the city's doing anything with affordable housing, we won't do any of it in these 5 neighborhoods, just to let tensions settle and kind of calm down. But then they extended it again in 2016, and it was super controversial. It was not a unanimous vote. There was a split vote every time, but ultimately it carried. So between 2012 and 2017, really up till this year, our staff has spent a lot of time preoccupied with this and researching this in response to try and build bridges with the community. So we did a lot of research around the links between non-market housing and social disorder and the things that residents were complaining about. And what we found is that there's no statistically significant relationship between socioeconomic and neighborhood indicators in the presence of non-market housing, at least not in Edmonton. We could not find a relationship between crime and non-market housing, and in fact, calls for service from a police perspective to affordable housing buildings in these neighborhoods was significantly disproportionately lower than other types of buildings in those neighborhoods. We also found that the investment pause did nothing to address poorly run market housing, which was often the source of neighbor complaints. So a lot of times we found that residents would conflate affordable housing with poorly managed rental housing, rooming houses, what we call problem properties. And then lastly, the pause prevented affordable housing in those locations, but that doesn't mean it makes it any easier to get it in to put it in any other locations across the city. So in the context of the pause, and in the context of reinvigorated political focus on affordable housing in 2017, And this is the first time our council since 2017 has been super, and even a little bit earlier, has been super supportive of affordable housing. And this is the first time that this support has existed in the absence of a boom or a severely constrained private market, which is encouraging because often it's just responding to the concerns around more median income people who can't afford rental or home ownership. And so in the last 4-year budget cycle, which was approved last year, council approved a 5-fold increase in municipal investment in affordable housing. And it was during a really quite a tough budget where a lot of things were left on the table that they had wanted to fund. And in order to help support the case to get this investment, we created a new city policy that also was recognizing the pause and called the Affordable Housing Investment Guidelines. And so to help counter the idea that there's too much affordable housing in one neighborhood or 5 neighborhoods, we said, well, every neighborhood should have enough affordable housing to house everybody who needs affordable housing. So 16% represents the number of households currently living in subsidized housing plus the number of households in core housing need. So we set a target across the city of 16% for all neighborhoods. And now obviously, not every neighborhood is going to have equal development potential for affordable housing. There's obviously a huge capital amount of money that would be needed to realize this goal. So we do think of it as a long-term aspirational goal. And in our new city plan, which is just being developed right now, they're going to be creating a district, which is between a ward and a neighborhood. So we'll probably end up applying this target to the districts just because it's more practical, and then it also allows us to prioritize affordable housing near services and amenities like transit. But that's one of the things that we kind of turn the pause into a positive to say, well, we're not going to have a threshold, but we will have an aspirational goal for all neighborhoods. And then we also have a few other requirements around our guidelines. So this time we've asked council to focus on or prioritize investments in projects where the degree of housing affordability is greater, so more of the deeper subsidy stuff, because a lot of what we've done in the past has been more near market, and we do have a significant portion of people spending more than 50% of their income on rent. Also, where there's funding from other sources, because ultimately the municipal government is still a limited funding partner relative to the other 2 orders, so we wanted to prioritize projects that leverage funding from them. We also want to prioritize projects that are in good proximity to services and amenities like transit, and then lastly, overall project design, which includes things like architecture, energy, and accessibility. And then to support the delivery of this policy, council approved $132.5 million over the next 4 years, which is, like I said, 5 times more than they've approved in any one budget cycle than previous, and we're hoping to accomplish a goal of 2,500 units, obviously heavily dependent on their ability to leverage funding from other sources, and mostly the other 2 orders of government. This is just a quick look at some of the programs that we're focusing on. One big thing, I'll just quickly say one of our big priorities is permanent supportive housing, because Edmonton's made a lot of progress on reducing homelessness, but we found that there's a significant population of people that have complex needs, trimorbidities, co-occurring physical health, mental health, and substance use disorders that just we have no housing for, and that's part of what's driving our homelessness issues. We're continuing our secondary suites program. We're continuing Serpas school sites. We also have a grant program where we give $10 million a year away to nonprofits to develop housing. And then we're prioritizing some investment in our existing inventory. We own approximately 1,000 units of social housing, of the social housing in Edmonton directly, the city of Edmonton does, and about 800 units through our nonprofit that we own called Home Ed. So some other things that we've done recently is we repealed that pause, so that was good. We finally got rid of that because we had the new policy come into effect, which was a strong enough case to council that since we had a 16% goal for all neighborhoods, we didn't need to have a pause on investment in 5 any longer. We also brought in some zoning bylaw changes. So Edmonton has effectively eliminated the single-family zone in our city. So anywhere in Edmonton, you can build up to, actually I'm looking at Michaela again, basically every lot can have a second, as long as it's big enough, can have a secondary suite and a garden suite. So 3 units. Thank you, giving me the thumbs up. Or a duplex or a semi, yeah, thank you. And we also included, made secondary suites legal in duplexes, semis, and row houses as well. We also repealed thresholds, some other related threshold style regulations that had been brought in around the same time as the pause, basically limiting the number of group homes you could have or lodging houses you could have on a block face, or the number of group homes and lodging houses you could have per neighborhood. So we got rid of all those too, because we found that was actually, turns out, an impediment to permanent supportive housing, which we now need so bad. And then the last, another set of changes we did was missing middle changes, which just basically made it easier to build higher density on smaller lots in all of our medium density zones. And we also simplified regulations under that to increase flexibility. So there's some nice diagrams there for people who understand planning drawings. Lastly, we are, like our counterparts in Calgary, exploring what inclusionary housing could look like in the context of pretty carte blanche powers that have been granted to us, for the time being at least, by the city charter. I'll just leave it there for the time being, which we do have. Basically, the NDP government, right before the last election, granted Edmonton and Calgary basically carte blanche with respect to inclusionary housing policy. And so we're not sure that we'll retain those powers, but we are exploring what those might look like. I'm looking at my counterpart from the province over there. And then increasingly, especially over the last year, we've been spending a lot of our time with increased emphasis on responding to end homelessness. And like I said, a lot of that has to do with the increasing visible street homelessness that we're experiencing in Edmonton. So Edmonton's actually had a lot of success with respect to homelessness, much like our counterpart in Calgary, and credit to the provincial government. I think a lot of that is because of their sustained investment since 2009 or so. But in Edmonton, we've housed 9,300 people through Housing First, and we've seen a 43% reduction in our chronic homelessness since 2009 as a result. But challenges persist, and our progress is at risk. And like I said, in some ways, it's like we've housed a lot of the people that were the easiest to house, and now we have a lot of people who are experiencing complex needs, and we just don't have the infrastructure or supportive housing to support them, to help them access and maintain housing. And so the city's put a huge focus on that. We have a goal of trying to get 900 units of supportive housing in the next 6 years, and we are putting in all the land, hoping to leverage that with the province and the feds. So that's about a $40 million contribution from us to support an overall capital of $125 million from the province and $80 million from the feds. We are looking at options around bridge housing, because although we have a very well-developed housing first strategy, we have tons of agencies that are super experienced with housing outreach and getting people housed. What we're finding is just, there are delays in terms of the time it takes to get someone into housing, whether it's getting them an ID, finding them a unit, helping them access benefits. And because we have an increasing population of street people who are experiencing homelessness and who are unsheltered and sleeping outside, we are seeing more and more the need for some type of bridge housing as like a stopgap to help us, so that we're not basically spending a ton of outreach worker time chasing people through the River Valley trying to find them when we're trying to get them into housing. And then lastly, we've also just, as of Monday, been given direction to look into problem properties and an SRO strategy. So we have thousands, over 2,000 properties in Edmonton that are illegal or non-conforming, but they're providing very low cost rental housing to very low income Edmontonians. But a lot of them are not well run and are increasingly causing challenges for neighbors. And so our executive committee on Monday just gave us direction to look at some combination of an increased enforcement response with a nonprofit rooming house strategy. So I know I can learn from my Sean and Abby, your guys' experiences there, and Sean mentioned Parkdale rooming house strategy, and so we're going to be looking at some of those solutions as well. And that brings me to the end.